Derek, I have a question for you.
I might have an answer for you, John.
What do you call a dragon that eats your adventuring party?
I'm not sure. What do you call
A party pooper.
them?
Let's move away from lies and fears. Perhaps it's time to leave. Coming out from the edge of deception, sailing into a new destination. Wanna join when you're walking and living out free. Laying down all the past situations. Every step is a new motivation. Wanna join when you're walking and living out.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of ShatterCast Unplugged. We are currently still social distancing, except for me and my wife, because we live together. So no distance between our hearts, except for the ones required by our rib cage. However, today, by adventure...
Oh my god! Oh no! What have we got involved in?
I just kept going, and it was just, I was like, oh, they didn't catch it. Today we are going to be talking about tabletop role-playing games, which is a not uncontroversial topic, which is to say that there are people on both sides of the fences about how they feel about it, and we want to just have a time of honest discussion. We're not going to be bashing one group or the other. We just want to hopefully bring some understanding, some unity, and let this be a time of good conversation and sharing our perspective. So when we talk about role-playing games, you may not immediately know what we mean. I'll share kind of what I think, and then everyone else, you're free to chime in. As Joel mentioned before we started recording, a role-playing game is a game in which you play a role. If you're familiar with maybe some more popular video games like World of Warcraft, or it still has a following today, but earlier in the time, EverQuest, there's a lot of Star Wars games that would be considered something RPG. And that role-playing game is the idea that you control a character that has maybe their own life, that has something that makes them unique compared to all of the other characters in the story. And so in World of Warcraft, you could play a brutish warrior that loves protecting his friends, or you could play a rogue that sneaks around and tries to stay stealthy and doesn't like to be seen. So there's all these different characters that you can play, and you get to tailor your class however you want. So to me, that's kind of the purpose of a role-playing game, or the definition of a role-playing game, is one in which you control a character that you get to make unique in some way. Anyone else want to chime in or add something to what an RPG might be?
I think when you look at it within the context of tabletop RPGs, so when you're sitting around the table and creating these characters, for me, it's all about storytelling, and storytelling as a group. Mm-hmm. There's some improv interactive with it, and there's some guidance, but ultimately it's group storytelling.
Yeah, I would agree, especially with tabletop role-playing game. That's the most succinct way I try to describe it, is that it's cooperative group storytelling. I like to imagine, when you're preparing for a play, I did theater for quite a long time. There's a period of time where you do table reading, where you just get used to the script, right? So imagine a tabletop role-playing game is a table reading where you don't have a script, where you're kind of getting into the idea of what your character is going to be.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. You're acting as a character, and you get to control how they grow, get to deal with maybe challenges that they're facing. And another kind of term for it is pen and paper role-playing game, to differentiate it from like video games and things like that, especially in our current times where we're not always able to gather around physical table. You can still do it online. And so it's another way to have fun with friends and build community around something that is fun.
Which you can go and check the video that we made on that.
We'll tell them more about that soon.
So Let's name some of the tabletop role-playing games that you might be most familiar with or have heard at some point, whether you're a fan of them or not. You know, we don't have to shy away from some of the names. So, Derek, as you mentioned before we were recording, one of the most popular ones currently is going to be Dungeons and Dragons. It's also the one that kind of started off about 43 years ago or so. It was the very end of the 70s there. Or was it early? Might have been early 70s. Now I'm going to totally lose all of my cred. I think it might have been 1972 now.
You don't really play games.
Sorry, I wasn't alive in 1972, so I have merely adopted the hobby, much like Batman adopted the darkness. So
you just had to slip that in there.
Please,
didn't you?
I did.
pray
It
for,
was easy.
please leave prayers. One like equals one prayer for like John, okay?
Nice. So there's Dungeons and Dragons. There's Pathfinder. Warhammer 40K is a little more of a war game that uses miniatures, but people definitely do play it as a tabletop role-playing game. Are there any others that you guys enjoy or are interested in?
Yeah, there's Star Trek Adventures. There is a bunch of different ones set in the Star Wars universe. There is some slightly more simple ones, Fate. There's things like GURPS.
This is
like,
Star Wars right here, this red book.
there you go.
I've also played some really ridiculous ones like Paranoia and Honey Heist, which
Yes.
are so absurd that sometimes you can only do one session of the story.
What makes him absurd?
Sorry?
So
What makes
that's a
them
great
absurd?
question. What makes them absurd? The thing that particularly makes Honey Heist absurd is that instead of playing normal people, you are a bunch of bears.
And we're trying to find honey.
So you might be breaking into a state fair. You're trying to steal the honey at the fair, and it's just, it's ridiculous and hilarious and amazing.
How often do you get to play Yogi Bear is what we're asking.
Yeah, usually when you go through and create a character, it's just a lot of fun and crazy laughs are had.
That sounds
Pretty much
cool.
any genre you can think of is covered by a role-playing game, or you can create one from a role-playing system. There's like mutants and masterminds for superheroes, and there's even some set in the setting of Lord of the Rings. We'll just talk about that later. What?
It's called Adventures in Middle Earth. Not that we have any familiarity with that one. I haven't read the books, honestly. So no secret, all of us here have at one point or another, and potentially currently, spoilers, play or have played tabletop role-playing games. What are some of the positive experiences that you have had, either from playing the game itself, being a part of the community, etc.? Open floor here.
Yeah, for me, back when I was in Full Sail, where the school I went to get my creative writing degree, me and my classmates, who were also screenplay writers and film writers, we wanted an outlet where we could do interactive storytelling. We can sit down and watch a TV show. We can play a video game, but there's a limited, both of those experiences are ones that you only experience with like your eyes, essentially. Like, and even with like video games, you're bound in the construct of what the game developer made. Like, you cannot step out of the pre-aligned rules. You cannot step out of the pre-aligned world that they've established. They're the ones who set the rules. But when you step into role-playing games, especially tabletop role-playing games, you have an unlimited amount of freedom that you can use there. So it's a great way to try out different type of stories, different type of themes, really explore things. I mean, none of us were professional improvists. You know, we were never great at the voices or the improv, but just trying things out was awesome. And this group I had, both people who were saved and not saved, people who were in the Christian faith and not in the Christian faith, I sustained that group for 5 years. We played that same group. It was once a week we would meet up, and this was the only way I could really hang out with people. And even after we graduated, long after we graduated, we still hung out for a long time. So the biggest perk of these role-playing games is that, unlike other media, every person, if you're doing it right, is involved in the process. There's a community that you build. There's stories that you tell. I know I played as Cho one time when John was being the game master of one game that we were playing, and I played as a monk who was trying to transcend, and we just have all these laughs when like we look back at all the shenanigans. I mean, it almost brings you back to a time when you're a kid where you just have your imagination run wild. Definitely. And the rules are simply there to give you some guidance and some direction. So that is the best part about the role playing is the community and the creativity, in my opinion.
I like it. I completely disagree. No.
Good.
I would say for me, 100% in agreement. I would say those two things as well. And you pretty much nailed everything I would say. I would just reinforce that as people who played video games, they started to get more and more free. You'll notice, like, think of some of the earliest video games. Think of Pong, right? You had this box that you could not leave the box, and everything you did had to happen within that box. And eventually that box got a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger until you get to where you have games like Skyrim or Ghost Recon Wildlands or Horizon Zero Dawn, or now there's 1,000 games that call themselves open world, that you don't have to go and do the next main point in the mission. There's all this other stuff you can do. Tabletop role-playing games are really, they precede all of that, but they take it to the next level, because instead of it being an open world video game, like you said, ultimately you're still bound by what the devs decide. And if this is the end of the map and there's a mountain range that your character can't climb, that's the end of the map. But those things don't really happen in tabletop role-playing games. So I love the freedom of choice that you get. And then the community, to me, is even more important. I've shared on this briefly, and I won't take up a lot of our time here. But I went through a really hard time in my life a few years ago that lasted for a couple of years. And the thing that got me through, while it wasn't Dungeons and Dragons, it was the people that I sat around the table with, playing that game with every week throughout the entirety of that period of my life. They grounded me. Almost all of them were people of faith, and they spoke life into me. And the relationships that I formed with them were so much deeper because of sitting around that table every week and playing a game, because you can get to really interesting and deep conversations that you may not have in your normal day-to-day life, because there's things that your characters will experience when you're playing a game set in Middle Earth that you will never experience. I'll never fight a dragon in my real life, right? I mean, it's 2020. They might be on the calendar for August. I don't know. But my characters, some of them have. And so it's a different kind of situation where you have to think through these things. And it affects the way that your character might interact with someone else. And you can actually have some really interesting conversations at the table based on what your characters experience. Hannah, Derek, Gabe?
I would just say, thanks so much for sharing, John. Appreciate that. And there's been some new studies coming out saying that there's some benefits to playing role-playing games, especially for younger students and teens and stuff, because it's a chance for them to build life skills. It's a chance for them to navigate like certain situations that they might deal with in life, like how do you handle arguments or disagreements, or how do you work together as a team? And it can also be a way to kind of help someone craft their self-image, because a lot of times when you're role-playing a character, it can be a character that either you wish you had some of the similar attributes, or a character that after a while starts reflecting some of your own personality. And so it can help someone who may be shy or something, like speak up by acting that out. And as they take that to real life, they can start getting some of that confidence. So for me, I sat around probably for 8 to 10 years playing with the same group of people. Most of us were just pastors, youth pastors in the area, and we just wanted to play a game, and we played some role-playing games, and that group is still some of my best friends today. And so I just think what you guys are saying about community and just the chance to have fun and to stretch your imagination, and as Joel was saying, to be a kid again, is kind of a lot of fun. So
I remember the first time that I started playing tabletop role-playing games. Well, the first one that I played was with Joel here, our very own Joel right here. And just because well, before I never had like the people to play with. It was just not, it's really like part of my culture when I was growing up. But the experience that I had it was just a lot of fun, man. And that probably was because of the people that I was playing with. Mostly, I believe that it was because of the people that I was playing with, but also as John was addressing before, it's just like these experiences or these things that you would never get to do otherwise. You know, I remember that the story that we were doing was like, okay, we're going to this random place, and I don't remember exactly where it was, but I remember there was like this plain thing, and there was a house there. There was a sensei, and then there started to be like a bunch of things, and we had to escape from there in a spaceship, and then our spaceship got destroyed, and it's like, okay, what are we gonna do? We're about to die. It's like, if we die, we can't keep playing. So it's like, okay, well, let's try to find a way to do it. And then anyway, like every decision would have to would affect what we were doing, and sometimes we wouldn't have control of the whole situations. It would be like also what the other person was doing would affect you, and all these different weird things. But it was just such, I don't know, it was just like a part of it that was like imagining all these things. And of course every person would have their own like way of seeing it, but I remember how I would look at the spaceship, how the spaceship would be, and then like what every single person was doing, how would I react to certain situations. It was just different and fun, and I don't know, it was pretty exciting. It was pretty exciting. And of course I would like just build, just like, okay, so going through these situations and this problem solving with the people around you would definitely help, because it's like, okay, well, how would another person address a certain problem? And maybe that would also help, like if just happened to be that session would be something similar to what a person was going through, right? As Derek was saying, it's like, okay, well, it's also kind of a therapy. It's like, okay, I can see the way that 4 different people would respond to a problem at certain situation, right? And that same way, it's like, okay, this is not me. I can just like leave myself, my problems for a while, and just like get inside this different world and see how it would react, and then apply those certain things, changing my perspective for 2 hours a week, or for 3 hours a week. I can change my perspective, and now I get a new perspective from this character that I myself am playing, right? But it's like just a different set of eyes. So I don't know, it was fun. It was interesting. It was pretty cool.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. You can go on.
A lot of the things that were addressed are things that are definitely important to me when I look at things I like about role-playing games. Community being a really big one. Gabriel, you touched on one of my favorite things about it, which is the memories that you create, because those experiences of your characters are so unique to that group that you're playing with, and a lot of them are hilarious. And also, just like from a practical standpoint, it's like given me more experience to be better at talking and being in social situations. Like if I'm someone who is typically anxious when talking to strangers or talking to people I don't know, working through that awkwardness with the idea that, oh, it's my character who's awkward, not me, you know, being able to sort of act that out helps you to kind of practice saying things, doing things. Like, I mean, just like anyone who wants to get better at improv, the practice is a big part of it. And it can be a great outlet for people who maybe aren't as comfortable speaking up.
Definitely. And to what you and Gabe and really everyone we've all been saying, the therapeutic part of it, not completely, but a large part of therapy is identifying and addressing and changing bad patterns of behavior or patterns of thought, things that, you know, something happens and it sets off this chain of events, and trying to address and change that. And one of the best ways that we can do that is by seeing how other people process things when they do it in a healthy way. And so, Gabe, what you were saying about, you know, sitting down and playing for 3 hours a week and getting to see 4 other perspectives. You may not think that you need to know how your best friend would handle fighting a dragon, but you don't know until you see it. And then you could be like, wow, that's really interesting. You know, it could also just be completely wacky and ridiculous. But I do know in my life for sure it was a very positive thing. That being said, we were going to talk about both sides. Said we were going to give this a fair shake. And so I want to transition now and have an honest conversation about what some of the concerns have been presented in the religious community, particularly the Christian one here in the United States. What are some of the concerns the church has? We have a bit of a list. I'm going to list off a couple things, and then we can talk about them. One, that some people may get a little too into it, that they could be taking it too seriously. Two, that there are a lot of systems that involve the use of magic. Three, that a lot of these worlds that are created in tabletop role-playing games have their own pantheon, and therefore they have their own gods, which your character might worship. And lastly, and this is not an exhaustive list, I just want to say these are just the 4 things we're kind of talking about. Lastly, that your game could include a lot of violence or otherwise graphic content. And so we want to talk through legitimately some of those concerns. Before we even say our response to them, let's just talk about what people are concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, there's ever since the beginning of the inception of role-playing games, going back to Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s, the artwork, you know, where you're going into this depths and you're fighting some demonic thing, you know, you're going after some sorcerer who's using the dark arts, you know, and there were some people, when they ran their game, just as we said, these role-playing games are a bastion of creativity. They might say, hey, let's do a dark campaign where we play as the bad guys. Let's like do a game where we're the ones involved in all the crazy dark magic stuff. And I think from somebody, if they see their kid and he's involved in one of those things, it can be very like, whoa, is he curious about getting into the occult? Is he or she announcing their faith? Is it just pretend? You know, and these questions go through your head. And I think that these concerns that are there, I mean, you know, I think that people can have a legitimate concern, and especially if they care about, you know, their kids not being exposed to different things or getting caught up in what would lead them away. I think that those are perfectly valid. And that's one of the things where I think it's a very case by case basis from what I've seen. You know, what some people may see as offensive and as evil and as wrong, the next person may not see it as that way. You know, and every group will be different. And these concerns about magic like that, yeah, I mean, these games, when the creators made these games, they did research into historical stuff, different people's beliefs of the old Grimm fairy tales, of things like that. Like same with like the Lord of the Rings. You know, Tolkien took stuff about the elven, you know, elves as a mythological part of that society, and he put his own spell on it. Mm-hmm. And the D&D things are the same way. As they took beliefs, they took these fake gods or whatever, and they put their own spin on it to create what they believe is a believable fantasy world. So I see why people are concerned with it, because some of the stuff is based off of older beliefs and those fairy tales and folklore. So.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely.
I remember you mentioned something about like taking it too seriously and going too deep into it. I can't. The thing about this is that it's saying the same thing as like, okay, well, our video games, what's causing violence in kids? It's exactly the same thing. It's like, okay, well, if I do anything else, then that's the cause that it's making me do these things. And I would say that there are deeper issues that
I would point to all violence pre-1970 for that argument.
And I can't. The thing is that, of course, if I want to take all swearing out of my life and all like slander or whatever it is, I don't want to start watching a content that has all this content and all these like bad words being said all the time, because it's still something that I'm receiving. That's my point of view into it. It's like, okay, well, Definitely. If I'm trying to get away from porn, right? It's not gonna help if I go to a movie that has nude scenes every 5 minutes, right? It's just not gonna work. But it's because there's already a pre-existing condition, let's put it like that, in my own life, right? Now, I am not gonna say, and I'm not here to say, I'm not here to call evil good and good evil. It is, I do not agree with nudity movies, but it was a good example. Personally, I do not agree with gore in video games. I think sometimes, just for the sake of realism or whatever it is, then there's many things put into games that it's not necessary to put. But that's for another topic. Getting too much into it, I don't believe that it's like an issue when, at least I haven't seen it with the people that I played, and I haven't seen it with in the lives of the people that I've played, that it's like, oh, well, you're getting too much into the game or whatever. I haven't seen anybody like just like disconnect themselves from reality just because of playing one of these games. As a matter of fact, it's more about like connecting, and as we were talking before, it's more of a help instead of just like, oh, well, yeah, now you can't understand the difference between reality and truth, for that matter. So I don't know what you guys have seen of it, or if you have had any experiences like that, because truth is, it's more than just something that we can say. It's like, have we seen examples of this or not? Or is it just something that people are making up for the sake of discussion?
I think, Gabe, that last thing you said there is a fantastic point. Is there are a lot of times where people are, this thing gets spread as if something is happening, whether it's actually happening or not, and it becomes a fear. I know to your point of taking things too seriously, there was a movie in 1982 starring Tom Hanks called Mazes and Monsters. And the main character in that movie, he's playing a Dungeons and Dragons kind of game called Mazes and Monsters, because D&D is copyrighted. And, they go and they get really into this game to the point where he does kind of disconnect from reality. And it wasn't the impetus for these fears, but it spurred them on, because you know how people read news stories. Eventually, the idea of this kid does this thing and dies is in a theme in a movie, and people are talking about the movie, and eventually, slowly over time, like you're playing a game of telephone, details are lost, and eventually it breeds this fear that, it's like the Tide Pod thing. How many actual people were eating Tide Pods? Not as many as you would think if you were just reading headlines. Now, people still did it, but it wasn't exactly a plague on our youth. And every 3 or 4 months, there's a new thing of the big thing that everyone is doing. And then inevitably we find out that very few people are actually doing it. And so for me, when we talk about like the taking things too seriously and how much it can, affect someone's life, game addiction is a real thing. I believe it's finally actually in the DSM-5 that recently came out, that people can get addicted. They can make poor decisions, but it's not the overwhelming majority. And to what you were saying, Gabe, the important thing there is personal responsibility and also understanding what our weaknesses are. If we are trying to cut back on cussing and having a bad attitude, then not taking things in that have that content is a fantastic decision. And I think that our personal convictions matter here. And if someone is watching this video, and even by the end of it, if you're still personally convicted not to engage in this stuff, then don't do it. Because if it's your personal conviction, then you have a responsibility there. I mean, the Bible says that if it's a sin for you, it's a sin for you. And there are things like that. And so take your personal convictions seriously. We're not here to say that you're wrong. We're just here to say that let's chat. Derek, I don't think you've jumped on this one yet.
Yeah, I agree with everything you guys said. There are legitimate concerns, and I would say anyone who is cautious about it or wondering about it, or as Joel was saying, if you have a family member you're concerned, I would say do some research, talk to them like, hey, why do you like this thing? And there's a bunch of people who happen to be Christians who like role-playing but feel like they can't share that because it's not always seen as a positive thing. So maybe just, hey, what about this do you like? Are there any dangers? Are there any concerns you have? What are some of the positive things? So or you might walk into a gaming store and see a bunch of people playing and like, I'm not sure about this rolling dice thing, like what's going on? So I would say, yeah, there can be some concerns, but find out, investigate, and if you find out that it's not something that is for you or that you agree with, that's totally cool as well. But yeah, do some research, and that's one of the reasons we're doing this video, to kind of explain a little bit to people so they can understand more.
Definitely. Well, those are some of the concerns, taking it too seriously, magic, other gods, and I think other gods is a legitimate concern. Especially of all the 4 of them, this is probably the one that would bother me the most, and violence or graphic content. So let's take a minute now and talk about how we have addressed these concerns, maybe in our own games, or we've seen it addressed in the community. What do you guys do, and what can you share that you think would help alleviate some of these concerns?
I forgot we were already recording. Hi, Patreon.